live on air. John Reed, John Appleby, Ethan Jewett. We've seen this configuration of miscreants before. What's going on, guys?
John, it's Friday afternoon. The week is slowing down, and thought I'd come and make some trouble.
Yeah, my hair's already headed to the weekend.
I can see that you've got that kind of Friday evening quiff going on.
Yeah, I'm ready to hit the clubs.
The Manchester clubs.
Yeah, you guys want to go clubbing, man? So let's see. I know Ethan wants to give John a hard time about climate change. Maybe we can save that to the end. No, but let's tell the viewers why we're here. We're talking about SAP UI5 and the impetus for perhaps open sourcing it and what that would mean. So, John, you want to just tell us why you dragged us on? Oh, and by the way, if this one sucks, it's not my fault because this isn't my idea or my topic. So, I'm taking no responsibility for this one.
I'll take blame for this one. That's fine.
So, John, why are we here, man?
Listen, it's really simple. My view is really simple. SAP have produced a really fine piece of software called SAP UI5, and the value of that is in SAP becoming relevant again. At the minute, it's a walled garden, and people are confused on how they use it, when they can use it, when they're licensed to use it, and a result, the uptake is not as fast as it would be. I got a really simple view, which is that if SAP releases it into open source and tends it, they'll get an increase in uptake of usage, and that'll drive relevance and increase the core license. There you go.
So can we have a little bit of a history, Ethan? Like, have you been tracking this issue? Like, I think you said the first blog on this was like a year ago. Like, how did this all go down?
Yeah, I think John dug that up. That this first came up as a topic a year or so ago, and I think people have been saying this since UI5 was a thing. I mean, it was sort of a stealth project, and then it became a little less stealthy, and then it became an actual component of NetWeaver and of HANA, and a key piece of SAP's UI story, right? So with Access Engine and that kind of thing, UI5 is really the way that we're supposed to write applications. And so the question is, SAP UI5 is a JavaScript application development framework, browser-based. Why should we use UI5 versus other frameworks that already exist, are more or less mature, but have their own advantages and disadvantages? And one of the advantages of a lot of other frameworks is that they tend to be open source and easily, or at least easily accessible. So there's a clear story for developers on any platform around how they get access to this framework, how they use it, and where they're allowed to use it, and if they have to pay, what they have to pay, and how that starts stacking up as they get more and more users. And the challenge with UI5 right now is that story is not really very clear, especially outside of the SAP ecosystem. And so it's a tough case to make to developers that they should invest a lot of time learning this framework, which is in some ways quite different from existing frameworks, as opposed to just going out and learning another framework, another JavaScript front-end development framework that they are sure they can use anywhere. So I think, for me at least, that's the major problem right now for UI5 adoption, is that there's not a clear story around when and where you can use it and what the cost is going to be. And so I mean, even for me personally, that actually makes it so that I can't use UI5 on some of my projects as far as I can tell. And that's really cut into my ability to sit down and learn UI5.
Yeah, I think that's all the right stuff, Ethan. And I'm just pulling from Björn Gurk's blog here, and the verbiage really tells you everything you need to know. It's like he says, SAP UI5 is a cool and great UI framework. It's based on open source and open standards like jQuery, HTML5, JavaScript, CSS, Less, and others. So what he's saying is that we're taking all this great open source stuff and we're extending it, and then we're not making it clear on how people can use it. I just think that's missing all the value.
Yeah, I think it misses a lot of the value. I mean, there is an optics aspect of it, of taking this open source stuff and using it in a project and not making it open source. I think legally, and I think the open source community is clear that that's actually an okay thing to do. But there is something to be gained from an image perspective around putting this back out into the community. John, I completely agree with you. I think the key question is, what does SAP get out of it? And I think developer relevancy and engagement, both within and outside the SAP ecosystem, is what they can get out of it. Because, I mean, let's be honest, I can build front ends for SAP or HANA applications using any of these JavaScript frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
There are free OData libraries out there, so integration is not really an issue. The question is, why should I be using UI5 versus something else? And in order for the answer to that question to be obviously UI5, then it has to be at least as easy and clear to use UI5 as other frameworks.
Yeah, I mean, John, what were you going to say?
Well, I guess I just wanted to understand what you think the downside is from an SAP perspective to doing this. Like, why isn't, if you guys make such a compelling case, why hasn't it happened already?
Well, I think you know the major reason why it hasn't happened already, and that's the lawyers.
Yeah.
This is not, and you've got to be fair to SAP on this. This is not, open source is not their home ground. And their lawyers are very, very careful from an intellectual property perspective, and I have no doubt that they're considering it, and they're tied up in process.
Yeah, it certainly takes time, yeah, I mean, we love to blame the lawyers. I think that's probably oftentimes the accurate thing to do with SAP. Of course, you can push things and make things move a little bit faster, and it's not really clear, I think, from our point of view, whether or not that's happening. So it's awfully hard to say. This type of thing can just take a really long time with SAP, and I really see that as a major risk for UI5 actually, because if it takes too long, you kind of lose your window. So the way it's been working out is that the JavaScript UI frameworks tend to have a year, maybe 2 years in the spotlight, and then the next great new thing comes along. So like right now, the cool new thing is AngularJS or Ember.js or something like that. In 2 years, there's going to be something else, something new, something better, something that's cooler. And at that point, UI5 is going to be 2 years old. And if it's only just then becoming open source, well, people will already have heard of it. They won't be quite as interested in it anymore. And it will make it harder to do that work of getting better developer engagement and visibility. So I think it needs to happen soon.
So is there a financial downside to SAP?
Well, they've invested.
I mean, at the minute, and maybe I can go in a slightly different direction first, John, because SAP UI5 is the framework for which their award-winning and popular Fiori apps are built upon. It's the UI framework for Fiori. And so the way SAP UI5 is monetized at the moment is via either Fiori or via HANA. It's effectively part of those.
Wait, did you just say award-winning?
Yeah, wins a little award from me.
I see the John Appleby Innovation Awards. Is that what it is?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. Well, I look forward to being nominated next year in the Outlier category.
Yeah, I don't know, John. I'm not sure that's going to happen.
Anyway, you were saying.
So, and this is kind of the thing is, I don't know of anywhere where they've sold it separately, but effectively it's considered to be monetizable in a sense because it's part of Fiori and it's part of HANA. So every time they sell a HANA license, SAP UI5 is rolled in with that, with the XS server. Every time they sell a Fiori license, a couple of cents goes to the SAP UI5 developers, and they think that I imagine they think that by giving it away they're leaving money on the table, but I think that the risk on the table is much bigger. So let's say I'm a big company and I like the Fiori concept, and really the concept is I provide an app to people that gives them roles, and they have a set of tiles which relate to them and the job that they do, right? So I have I'm a manager, so I have an approval, or whatever. Or I travel, so I have a travel expense role, and I can click on that. So now, and now let's take the inevitable situation, which is I have a bunch of systems, of which SAP is one. Now, if I decide that I'm going to build my employee-based apps on the Fiori style framework with the SAP UI5 framework, and I'm building my own Fiori-esque apps, then what happens is I'm thinking, well, now I've got no clear way to build apps against non-SAP platforms. So maybe I'm actually not going to use SAP UI5, and I'm going to use some other framework for which the use of intellectual property is clear, and then SAP loses out on the Fiori apps as well. And here we go. Or worse, the customer starts building apps on a bunch of different frameworks, and that's really no better. Why not give away the framework for use, and it's going to encourage people to then pay for the Fiori apps. There we go. Encouraging people to pay for the Fiori apps encourages people to use core licenses more, which means they either use up shelfware or they need to buy more core licenses. SAP pours money into the core license coffers. Everybody wins. There you go.
So we're back to adoption versus monetization then.
Well, those two things, as far as I'm concerned, are implicitly interlinked, don't you think?
Yeah, in the longer view, right?
I think SAP has to take a longer view on this.
Yeah, I think they really do. I mean, the question I asked a couple of days ago on Twitter: has there ever been a successful SAP UI refresh that cost money? I can't think of one. So, I mean, the customers have already bought these applications. They own the core, and what really SAP's core product is the ERP applications, and now the technology platform around HANA and around mobile. So, like, the UI framework that sits on top of that is not what people are really buying when they buy SAP. I mean, they never have. Like, you didn't buy SAP for the UI, right? But SAP has had a couple of like somewhat successful UI refreshes, but they've mostly been within the GUI or within their existing web frameworks, and they didn't cost additional money on top of the licenses that the customers had already bought. They have had also unsuccessful UI refreshes, and it seems to me like the defining feature about those oftentimes very unsuccessful refreshes was that they cost a lot of money on top of the existing applications that customers had bought. So, I mean, it's in nobody's interest for SAP's UI to be no good, and I think if you look at history, then the refresh needs to come with the application, and not be something that they have to go out and sell the customers separately, so that you end up in a situation where, well, yeah, a few customers buy it, but it doesn't revitalize the whole customer base.
John,
So
where do you think personas fits into that?
Right. I mean, this is a debate that we've been having with SAP around should they be charged for these UI enhancements or not, right? And up until this point, Sam Yen, who owns UI globally, has been, I think, pretty diplomatic about responding to these questions around free, but ultimately saying we are planning to charge customers nominal, relatively nominal, fees for these UI enhancements, and that, his response has been the sales pipeline for these technologies has been good. So, in his view, he's kind of made his business case for it, and that's kind of where he stands. And I would put personas in that category to some degree, right? I mean, personas is intended to provide immediate pain relief for users who are stuck on UIs that are fairly clunky. It's not intended to change, the future of SAP's UI direction. It's more, well, lipstick on a pig is unfair, but that's a little bit of
lipstick on a very pretty pig.
Lipstick on a very pretty pig, right? But whereas Fiori gets to be a more interesting conversation because that's SAP's sort of intended future. If not Fiori, then what SAP calls Fiori-like applications. And I guess what you're making the case that maybe SAP might continue to charge for Fiori, but that they wouldn't charge for the underlying UI5 technology.
Yeah, I definitely not saying that SAP should stop charging for the Fiori apps.
Right.
Um,
But you're saying give away the framework that they're built on.
yes, because it
Yeah.
increases the relevance and it increases the chance
Yeah.
that people are going to buy the apps.
Isn't this a very similar conversation that we've had around mobility, which is essentially give a lot of the frameworks away that are used, not the frameworks that are used to manage infrastructure and things like that, but the frameworks that are used to develop apps? Seems like
Um,
a very similar conversation.
I think it's similar, but it's different. The big problem with mobile, right, was, and it might well be that the problem with SAP UI5 is similar, but the problem with mobile was the bewilderingly confusing licensing options and expense of rolling out simple apps. I don't think that Fiori suffers from that, but as I understand it, Fiori apps are pretty simply priced by seat.
Right.
But I think that there are some similarities in the SAP UI5 point, which is that there isn't clarity on the license model, the usage type, or how it's monetized. But I think it manifests itself in a different way, and it just manifests itself by people just not using it for those things because they can't be bothered to deal with it. There's just no value in a framework. There's no value in paying for a framework. There are many good free ones.
Yeah, I think that's the core issue. I mean, and I think that's a core difference from mobile as well, because there weren't good mobile stack frameworks that are free. I mean, there was PhoneGap, there were cross-application development frameworks, and in fact, they're embedded into the mobile platform that SAP sells. But the platform itself, there's no alternative that is equally compelling. So it had its own adoption issues, but in the case of UI5, the industry is rife with alternatives, many of which are very, very, very good, and are excellent competitors to UI5. And so if UI5 isn't competitive on even one important dimension, in this case, where can I use it and how much does it cost, then there's no reason to use it over another framework.
And if that happens, it will just, and this is guaranteed, it will become irrelevant. And from the future of the core apps and Fiori apps, the core license and Fiori apps, that would be a really bad thing for SAP.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're looking at even the larger ecosystem, I mean, really, what SAP, I'm sure, wants is, we provide all the software that you need. You don't need to go look somewhere else. We'll provide you the software that you need to develop your enterprise applications. And so whatever SAP can do to give people these good tools and make it clear that there's no need to look at other application frameworks is really helping SAP. So they can offer better integration, and they can offer a framework that can be used with everything that you have in your enterprise, not just the SAP stuff. It helps spread SAP out across enterprises. So
I think
I
there's
think
another.
it's really a positive for SAP there.
I think there's another kind of really important dimension, and as far as I can tell, 2014 is perhaps going to be the most pivotal year in SAP's entire past, because it's going to be the year where they move, at least in my opinion, from a core on-premise per seat licensing model with maintenance to a more flexible license model that's based upon subscription. And I think they're going to start to transition some of these large core ERP customers into paying per annum, and to transition their legacy licenses across. It's kind of Adobe style. And I think when that happens, customers are going to aggressively recalculate the licenses that they need to try and get the best deal possible. In the meantime, anything that SAP can do to increase usage of its core ERP customer base, that's got to be #1 priority, because if I can get another 20% of the organization using time and expenses or approval workflows, they're getting more value and they're getting more usage. So when it comes to time to renegotiate those licenses, and that's inevitable for that's going to happen probably over a 5-year period. If we take Adobe to be an example, they're going to be negotiating it on a higher value base. that might be the single most important thing. And by comparison, the revenue they can get from SAP UI5 as a framework is this. Well, I don't know. What do you think, John? You're a cloud junkie.
Well, I think it's easy to say you're a cloud company by offering hosted solutions of various kinds, and SAP actually does have also multi-tenant offerings in some areas, but you do have to start thinking about how cloud, the real cloud believers, they talk about how really cloud changes your entire business model, how you pay for software, how you consume it, how you develop it and design it, and you think a lot in terms of, to me, one of the defining points about cloud in the long run is going to be ecosystems, right? So when you hear about what is the number of apps that have been put up on App Exchange on Salesforce, it's something like 1 million. Like they recently passed a threshold. When you hear about something like that, you realize that that's a major point of traction for their platform, right? It's not just about buying an app or consuming an app. It's you're kind of buying into a whole community of partners and developers that are constantly building onto your products, right? And I don't think you're going to be able to do that without giving away the tools to build the applications. That just becomes part of, in my mind, how you really approach cloud. If you want to say we're in the cloud, I think that's going to become a sort of a fundamental criteria. So I guess I would agree with that. I mean, adoption is really a key factor in what happens, because after a while you reach a so-called tipping point where if you don't have that adoption, you're stuck with a lot of unsavory scenarios. I mean, look at what happened to, BlackBerry and RIM. Like, had BlackBerry built up a significant developer community, would that have altered their fate? It might well have,
Yeah. Do you want to be a BlackBerry or do you want to be an Adobe? Is the end point, isn't it? And that we don't necessarily have choice, but
yeah, and I think it would be really interesting. Like, Adobe's an interesting example in some ways, but they also impose somewhat of a forced march on their customers without a whole lot of warning either. And so, at some point, you have to start delighting people and not just herding them around to different models. So
yeah, I think
right.
I mean, and there's no denying the value that SAP has historically provided in its apps. But as John, I mean, it's just like you were saying, the more value they can provide, the better position they're going to be in the market. And UI is a really important aspect of application value, and it's something that's locked a lot of potential users out of SAP applications in the past because it's simply been not accessible in many use cases. And so, giving developers the tools to make SAP's applications accessible to more people, hey, I mean, what is there to complain about there?
Well, I think what's really interesting too, and I don't know, John, if you're seeing this at Bluefin in the field, and maybe you too, Ethan, but the user experience is starting to really matter when it comes to the actual sales of new software, because in the past it was always like, well, these newcomers are up against it in terms of depth of functionality, but you're hearing again and again that I can sacrifice some depth of functionality if I buy into a great user experience that my employees and my partners are going to love using, and iterative release cycles that are coming out frequently are going to address the functionality gaps, or we're going to build our own extension on that platform and address it ourselves. So that depth of functionality thing is kind of going away, and so then you're kind of left with the integration thing, which is, well, it's a lot easier to integrate our stuff, but that's starting to also get a little weaker as a sales pitch with the much more open standards and open APIs. And so now you're just seeing user experience trump everything else, because if people aren't going to use your software, they're not going to adopt it. And SAP can use this to its advantage as well. I talked to one SAP customer at Sapphire Sales on Demand that said, frankly, Sales on Demand, which is now called Cloud for Customer, it didn't have the best functionality, but we like the user experience better. So that can go in SAP's favor in some cases as well. But to me, that's what's selling software right now.
I think I think, John, the way, I mean, to put it really simply, we don't have a project which is starting or has started in the last month or 2 months or is currently in the sales process that doesn't have a UI component. And pretty much all of those that have a UX UI component, they're all Fiori. All the ones that are based around apps, around core ERP, because customers have seen it and they like it and they want it. It's that simple.
Well, and think about how much that's changed since like 5 years ago, right?
We were writing WebDimbro for ABAP, which has to be the most horrible user experience. Actually, it's not a very nice developer experience either, if we're going to go there. But that's what it was back then.
It's gotten so much better. I mean, just developing UI5 applications, just straight up writing the JavaScript is actually a pretty good developer experience. And the tools that SAP is now releasing around App Builder and that kind of thing are making it even better. So, I think it's a good framework, and SAP is going in the right direction. But they have to drive adoption of the technology framework, and the way to do that with UI5 is to make it available for people to use everywhere, I think. And open sourcing it is one excellent and well-tested in the industry way to do that.
Yeah, and I guess I have one final point that I wanted to make, which is SAP sells predominantly to its core ERP customer base. It did that when it acquired Business Objects, and it did that when it acquired Sybase, and it continued to sell back into the same place it always sold. That's obviously been a successful strategy for them. But what we're seeing with HANA is the real high value use cases have nobody in a room that knows anything about core ERP or SAP as a core ERP vendor. I was in a meeting yesterday, and I didn't even ask, but I knew none of them have ever developed on ABAP. They don't know what ABAP is, and they're not interested. And they were interested in HANA as a platform. I think that the journey that SAP would go on to open source SAP UI5 would bring them closer to the customer base that would see value in HANA as a platform, and I think that would provide a really interesting knock-on effect. Be it the startup communities, John, that you've done those success stories for, those guys, they're prime candidates, or be it the front office of major institutions around the world. Those people are all people that can get value out of HANA as a platform. I think this will help.
It's a good organizational exercise, I guess.
Yeah, because of the people you have to reach out to and the kudos in the community, all of those things would bring the HANA story out as well. I've no doubt. Anyway.
Were there any other points that I know that Jan Pennekoff blogged about this recently? Were there any other points that came out of his blog post that we haven't covered?
Well, he had 13 reasons, so I don't know.
Yeah, there were quite a few. I think we haven't covered some of them. I mean, Jan's reasons I think were good, and they were the kind of standard, like, why do you open source a software project reasons. And it was things like optics and community involvement and contributions back into the project. And if SAP went with UI5 the true open source route and really made it an open source project and pushed it out to have its own governance and accepted contributions back from the community, hey, that would be awesome. And I think it would actually really potentially accelerate the UI5 project and help fill in some areas where it might currently be a little bit weak. In my opinion, SAP doesn't even need to go that far. They just need to get it under a license. An open source license does the trick, but there are other options. But they need to get it under a license which allows people to use it in any circumstance, in any type of application, and makes it clear what the uses, makes it clear when, where, and how you can use it and how much it's going to cost. I think that's the key thing that they need to do with UI5.
I couldn't agree more. Not everyone agrees with us on that, Ethan, and the comments on Jan's blog are testimony to that. Some believe that it should be truly open source. I don't think it matters as long as it's easy, it's clear what the license model is, and that license model doesn't require handing over money.
Yeah, and I mean, personally, I think it would be better if it were truly open source, but I don't think that it's completely necessary. Like, I think that there are a lot of steps in between, and I think hitting any of those points is going to be a major improvement.
Yeah.
Ethan, have you thought about building commercial apps in the SAP ecosystem? Have you sort of looked at the stumbling blocks in the way of that and that kind of thing?
Yeah, and now that there's the Partner Edge for App Development program, I think those stumbling blocks have become a little bit less large, let's say. So there's a little bit more of a clear path to get access to the necessary tools and to build applications and to get them into the SAP store. So yeah, I've definitely looked at that. The question continues to be that there's not a completely clear path to doing that, and there's also a question of transition. So the way that at least I would often think about building an app would be oftentimes consulting driven. So I'll have a customer that is interested in building some kind of application, and work with them and build this application and come to an agreement over the intellectual property of that, and maybe do it as some kind of joint venture. A lot of the people I talk to now are not in the SAP ecosystem. So I'm helping build the applications that would be interesting for the SAP ecosystem, should end up in the SAP store. But when I'm working with a customer that's not in the SAP ecosystem, at this point, I can't recommend UI5 because, first of all, they can't use it, and secondly, there are other options, and there's just a lot more current developer availability for other application development frameworks. So it's hard to recommend SAP UI5 in those scenarios, but
I think Ethan has been logged out.
it's like something that I really could recommend in those scenarios, and then it would make it.
Hey, Ethan. Ethan, we
the
lost.
SAP store.
Ethan, paging Ethan.
Sorry, my internet decided to crap out.
You are back. We missed some of your spontaneous genius.
And I got a wrap in a second.
Maybe
actually.
It's trying to tell me something.
Yeah. Let's finish Ethan's thought though. Ethan, you were saying the part where we lost you. You said but, and then we lost you. So if you can continue from that.
I'm not sure what the part before the but was, but I think with the customers that I work with that are not in the SAP ecosystem, I'm developing apps with them that would be very interesting to SAP customers and should really end up in the SAP store. But if we're not developing them with SAP technologies, because currently I can't recommend to use something like UI5, then it makes it more difficult to get those applications back into the SAP ecosystem.
All right, John, you have any final parting words? Did this hangout live up to your expectations as content organizer?
I'm happy. I mean, we got our point across. I mean, I just don't think this is something SAP from a commercial and existential point of view has to just go ahead and do. And I'm sure that there are people that want to do it. And I think somebody just needs to get behind it and push. So good luck to them.
Yeah, well, maybe this hangout in all of its high fidelity will be the turning point.
Maybe a little help. There's plenty of stuff out there.
I'd like to see legal seize the baton and run with it.
Yeah.
Right. And hey, a model for open sourcing pieces of the SAP technology stack would not be a bad thing, right?
No, it would be great.
Might come in handy in the future as well. Well, guys, I'm sorry you didn't have a chance to settle your differences over climate change. I was going to offer that as a bonus to our listeners, but it looks like
I think we can handle that offline.
So you guys just catch John and Ethan on Twitter, and they can maybe settle their differences over these issues. It was a pleasure, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John.